Good morning, good morning, good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting now. So I'm Sheomo Fikoya. I'm an Extension Associate with Kentucky State University. I'll be moderating this session. So this session is on variety selection for Kentucky farmers. And I just had some quick housekeeping. So I have this session feedback sheets that I'll be giving out to everyone, and afterward I'll be collecting them. Please kindly fill them out. And also, if you have any question during the course of the session, please kindly raise your hand. I'll bring a microphone to you so everyone can hear you. So for this morning, we have Dana Hilfinger, as she's from Johnny Seeds. Please let's welcome Dana.
Thank you. You guys hear me okay? Hold on. Okay. Can you hear me okay now? Good? Okay, great. And this is a clicker. Is that right? Okay, good morning. Hi, my name is Dana Hilfinger. I'm the territory rep for Johnny's Seeds for Kentucky. I've been with Johnny's for about 4 years, but I'm relatively new to Kentucky. I just started covering the region about 4 months ago. So still getting to know all of you. So if you haven't met me yet and you want to come say hi, I'd love to chat with you and learn about your farm. And, I've been really enjoying getting to know the state so far. So I'm going to talk today about variety selection. I'm kind of the fill-in session. So I've given a presentation kind of like this before, but I'm kind of tailoring a little bit to some of the growing conditions here and what you might want to be thinking about when you're kind of flipping through a seed catalog and trying to distinguish between the different varieties. Okay. So this is what we'll be talking about today. Start out with kind of the factors involved in variety selection. So, when you're seeing these different labels on a crop, what does that actually mean? I'll go through kind of woven into that whole conversation. I'll go through some variety recommendations that are specific to this kind of climate. And then I'm hoping, at the end, if we have a bit of time, there should be some time for questions and discussions around what you all are seeing are working well in the area. I didn't mention this before also, but before I was working for Johnny's, I worked for Extension in Ohio for 4 years. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I cover Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia. My background is in organic vegetable farming, and I was doing that before I worked for Extension. So I'm approaching a lot of this as a grower and someone who's done a lot of crop planting in the winter as well. Before I kind of get into some of the variety selection stuff, I just wanted to mention a few things about, I think, what Johnny's offers in terms of qualifications for talking about variety selection. Johnny's is based in Albion, Maine. That's about an hour and a half north of Portland, inland, about an hour from the coast. We have 200 acres of managed property in and around Albion, and that equates to about 27 miles of bed production. The farm is not all certified organic, in part because of the different seeds that we receive in our trialing, but it's managed pretty much exclusively using organic practices, even if a couple of the seeds or some of the seed varieties are not. And with that comes a big emphasis on soil health. So it's actually a pretty beautiful system there. They're doing a nice rotation of walk paths that are cover cropped, and then the following year turn into production beds for our trials. About 50% of the acreage is in cover crops annually. And I think the last measure I saw showed that we had we're using over 10,000 bales of hay annually in the operation. So a big emphasis on organic mulch inputs as well in the system. And the research farm itself is dedicated to seed production, to breeding efforts, and then a lot of it is dedicated to this trialing and selection. So anything that you see in the Johnny's catalog has been trialed at our research farm in Maine or in partner locations if that makes more sense. Generally, they've been trialed for years. So it's not the first time that we're seeing it, but we've been able to see it over multiple seasons, show to be a good variety for those kinds of conditions. So it's really a year-round effort. We have at this point over 20 high tunnels as well across the farm's properties that we are, it's been an ever-expanding component of our trialing effort just because of the use of high tunnels amongst growers. And then we also, and this is, I really want to emphasize this, we do a lot of regional trials across the country. We have a big regional trial program and coordinator who works with growers around the country, who works with universities, who are submitting either products that we've bred or other breeders that we're working with, submitting those varieties to field days to trial them in different environments. And me personally, in my role, I am involved in kind of helping to find some of those regional trialers in the region that I work. So if you're ever interested in participating in some of those trials, I know we have at least one person in the room who's done that before, in Ohio at least, and we're always looking for more trial partners. We're looking for a diversity in terms of type of farm to trial. So don't think that you have to be a 50-acre certified organic farm in order to trial varieties. We really are looking for how varieties perform in a variety of different circumstances. Okay, so enough about Johnny's. I hope kind of like that gives you a little bit of context though for understanding why we can talk about variety selection with a good amount of expertise. So how to find the right variety for your situation. If you look through a seed catalog, you see a lot of options. Which onion is the right onion for the job? I want to put a disclaimer before we kind of dig into this, that variety selection is probably not the first thing you should be thinking about when you're thinking about your farm, right? If there's not kind of a basic system in place for soil preparation, if you haven't figured out water management and proper drainage on your farm, if you don't have a general handle on fertility, then that's where you want to start. And you can put some amount of effort into variety selection, but I would probably discourage you from trying to purchase a really Cadillac variety or something if some of these other things are not figured out. So with that caveat in mind, what are some things to consider when you're thinking about what varieties to grow? So number one up there is market demand. This is probably the driver for folks in terms of what you're looking to grow in many cases, right? Is what do people want to eat? Hybrid versus open pollinated varieties. I'll talk a little bit more about that and kind of the distinctions between those two and how that can guide decision making. The productivity of varieties. So, maybe everyone's saying like, yeah, we just want something that's going to yield higher. In biology, there's trade-offs for higher yield. And sometimes that might be that you're getting a less flavorful variety or a variety that's not going to have quite the color of a variety that's a little bit lower yielding. So depending on your context, that might be fine. Or you might be looking for something that's kind of in that like higher flavor caliber quality. Seasonal slotting. This is a really important one. I'll talk more about that. Days to maturity. Also talk a bit more about that and using that kind of as a tool for organic farm management. Disease pressure. Understanding the disease pressure in your specific region is very important to make sure that you're selecting varieties that are really going to be applicable to you. The context that you're growing a crop in, so whether it's the field, or the tunnel environment, or the greenhouse, your own skill level. So again, this kind of gets back to what I was mentioning as that disclaimer. If you're, just starting out, it might not make sense to, to go for some of these varieties that are really kind of require a certain like trellising system or a certain kind of pruning approach in order to be successful. And then redundancy as well. So as you all probably know from purchasing seeds, varieties come and go. It's a good idea not to be too attached to one single variety, and that's especially true for certain crops where that turnover rate can be really high. A lot of varieties, what's available out there is not dictated by Johnny's or Johnny's customers. For some crops, and I'll say like spinach is a great example of this, we are not the target market for most spinach breeders. California is the target market for most spinach breeders. So when we're receiving spinach seed to trial, we're testing whether those varieties work well in a more humid climate like in the Northeast or in the hotter summers of a lot of the heartland. But we're not necessarily the ones who are determining whether or not that seed is going to be produced. So as a result of that, like those varieties can turn over really quickly because the disease pressure in California really dictates what's going to be produced. So just know that, for certain crops, it's unlikely that you're going to see a variety stick around forever, and it's always a good idea to kind of be trialing other varieties to see how they compare so that you're not in a pinch if, you're really dependent on one thing and it's gone the next year. Okay, so I'm going to dive in. Oh, I should say before we could continue, I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about the bolded things here. So that's kind of what we're going to go through next. And I'll maybe stop after each section to just, if people have questions or comments, and we can work it that way. And then at the end, there will be a little bit of time as well to chat more. So, okay, hybrid versus open pollinated varieties. How many people in here feel like pretty confident that they know the difference between those two things? Okay, got a handful of hands and some people shaking their heads. So I'm going to talk about it. So hybrid versus open pollinated really refers to two different ways of pollinating crops for seed production. So open pollinated varieties are where pollination occurs by some kind of natural mechanism in a big open field, basically. So that's, imagine a field of red Russian kale that's grown for seed production. That whole field is grown as one cultivar of red Russian, and then it's allowed to kind of be pollinated by wind, by insects, etc., to produce that seed crop. As the result of that kind of pollination, generally you see the resulting seed crop is going to be a little bit more genetically diverse. So that's going to mean that it's going to be a little bit less uniform than if you had a really controlled kind of process of pollination where every crop was pollinated very specifically with a certain male and a certain female plant. So hybridization, in contrast, is that controlled method where you're taking two parent lines and you're crossing them to get a new variety. And those two parent lines are those are often bred for multiple years to be very kind of specific and homogeneous. So the resulting plant for a hybrid is what is sometimes called an F1 population. So in a lot of seed catalogs, you'll see it listed as F1. So that's a little bit of background kind of about what those two different crops are. In terms of how it relates on a practical level, there's a couple kind of key characteristic differences between those two kinds of plants. So hybrids often benefit from inbreeding what's called hybrid vigor. Basically, the crossing of two really genetically distinct plants results in a kind of something that's greater than the sum of its parts. So a lot of times you'll have a bigger kind of leafy, more larger, more productive plant as a hybrid than you might get as an open pollinated variety. Hybrids also, you can tend to breed in very specific disease resistances. So if there's, a single gene that results in the, resistance to, say, like powdery mildew, you can take a parent line that has that gene and cross it with another variety that maybe has all the flavor characteristics that you want to be able to get that powdery mildew resistance into that variety. So it often allows you to have some more disease resistance capabilities than you would with open pollinated varieties. As you can imagine, as I was talking about like how the two different types of plants are pollinated, hybrids generally require a lot more kind of like very specific effort by people, and so as a result, they tend to be more expensive. So open pollinated varieties are a great option that are often less expensive to purchase. And then, finally, if you try to save the seed from a hybrid variety and grow it again yourself the next year, generally you would not get plants that are going to look like that seed that you grew the previous year. So they're not going to grow true to type. That's probably maybe the thing that most people are most familiar about with hybrids, is that you can't save seed from them. Again, you can save seed, you're just not necessarily going to get what you got the year before. In seed catalogs, you'll know if something is a hybrid because it will have that F1 label next to it. So if it doesn't have that label, then it's not a hybrid variety. And just kind of another fun fact to know, not all types of plants, so not all crops can be hybridized. So there's some varieties like peas, like lettuce, like soybeans that you'll never see, or currently at least you won't see a hybrid variety of those kinds of plants because the morphology of the flower makes it really hard to hybridize those plants, to pollinate them with a separate male and female genetics. So the only kind of other point I really want to make about these two different types of seed are that all open pollinated varieties are really not created equal. So in the seed world, we have what's called strain stewardship. So an open pollinated variety, say something like red Russian kale or sugar snap pea, that you might see sold in a variety of different places, those might not all be exactly the same. If you grow them out, they might not all look the same. And that's because different companies or breeders or seed production facilities can kind of develop and cultivate their own strain of that. And they're doing that by doing something that's called selecting or roguing those seed crops year after year. So if I'm growing a seed crop of sugar snap peas, and this actually, this happened with Johnny's about 10 years ago. They kind of took on this project because they started to see in sugar snap peas that there were a lot more of those snow pea type peas within the mix. And so as a grower, you would grow them and maybe like 10 or 15% of the peas that you were growing would be that snow pea shape. So they started growing out these seed lots every year and then like manually taking out all of the snow pea style pea plants from those lots, so that year over year, you're slowly getting only the seeds from the plants that are that sugar snap shape. And so then after a few years of that, then you have a seed lot that's really going to be kind of that more uniform sugar snap. So that's just something kind of to be aware of, that if you're buying the same variety from a few different places and it's an open pollinated variety in particular, you might be seeing some big differences in kind of what something's looking like. Any questions on hybrid versus open pollinated varieties now? Yeah.
Save the seed, and you won't get the similar thing, but you at least get something that would resemble the vegetable, and you still can eat it, or it just
For a hybrid, if you save seed from a hybrid? Yeah, so like this picture kind of shows an example of it. Like basically what happens if you save the seed from that hybrid, you're gonna get in the next generation a mix of like different type plants that are gonna have various genes from those two parent lines kind of mixed together. So some of them might be more productive than others. Some of them might be edible. Some of them might not, really survive that well. It's just going to be a big mix. It's not that it's inedible or anything. It's just that you're not going to have that kind of uniformity and predictability that you would otherwise. Yep. Generally, it's not illegal, especially as if you're, not doing it for commercial sale, to like save that kind of hybrid seed and replant it. A lot of those kind of politics only come into play when you're talking about the big grain seed companies. Yeah. Any other questions on hybrid versus open pollinated? Good? Okay. Cool. Okay, I want to talk a little bit then about seasonal slotting, and this is where I'll start to talk kind of more specifically about certain varieties that I think, are kind of well targeted for this region. So seasonal slotting is this idea of choosing certain varieties to grow, really kind of choosing varieties for certain times of year. So instead of just saying like I'm growing this one variety of lettuce and I'm gonna grow it year round, this is really the concept of kind of picking varieties specific to different conditions throughout the year. So why would you want to do that? Varieties, there's a lot of difference between varieties in terms of their temperature tolerance. So both for hot conditions as well as cold conditions. For bolt tolerance, so how quickly they are to go to seed, for disease pressure at different times of year. So maybe you really only experience powdery mildew or alternaria pressure kind of later in the summer going into the fall. So you could grow a different broccoli variety early in the year that doesn't necessarily need to have that kind of disease resistance. And then also, kind of understanding the seasonal importance of having different traits can make it so that you can kind of more selectively buy some of those more expensive varieties to really kind of fit for those conditions that they're well adapted for. So sometimes like varieties in particular, I'm thinking like bell peppers that have Phytophthora resistance, those tend to be more expensive varieties in part because of the labor that goes in to be able to breed that resistance into the crop. So, maybe you don't need your whole field planted in Phytophthora-resistant bell peppers. Maybe you only want a portion of your field planted in that as kind of an extra insurance in case you have a wet year. But otherwise, you could plant a variety that doesn't need that. And then I'll say also, kind of throughout like a little inside baseball about seed catalogs, for us, we use the label of workhorse or widely adapted as, kind of ways to describe a variety as doing pretty well as like a one size fits all. So, so if you only want to grow kind of one variety throughout the year and you don't maybe want to have the like particularness of like thinking about that seasonal slotting, look for varieties that are listed as that widely adapted or workhorse style. And there's a couple examples that kind of come to mind on this that I know are popular. Space as a spinach variety is one that does pretty well throughout the entire year, both in terms of its bolt tolerance, but also going into the winter months. And then Rover radish is a red radish that has a nice bolt tolerance, but is also pretty adaptable into the cooler months as well. So seasonal slotting, I think probably the main, kind of question a lot of people have kind of coming out of that is like, okay, so what's going to work best for those hottest months of the summer? So I wanted to kind of suggest a few things here that we've seen really do well in those conditions. So from a leafy greens perspective for lettuce, it's hard to grow lettuce in the summer period in most parts of the United States that are below, Michigan or so, it's hard to grow lettuce in the summer. That being said, there are differences in romaines in particular in terms of their bolt tolerance. Two varieties that we've seen do really well, that I've seen do well in southern Ohio, and talking to some growers in this region, are Sunland and then Blue Rock. They have a little bit different plant structure. So Sunland tends to be a bit bigger and a little bit taller. Blue Rock's a little bit more squat. So you have kind of a few options there depending on what your romaine customers would be looking for or what your end use is. And then just as a general category for lettuces in the heat, I would strongly recommend anyone to look in that Summer Crisp or Batavian type category in a seed catalog. Those are varieties that are really the most bolt tolerant, but also tend to hold that sweet flavor for longer than other varieties who might be getting bitter faster in the heat. So there's a whole kind of like class of different plant shapes, colors, types for in that Summer Crisp category. One that's been kind of perennially popular is Muir. It's been a variety that we've carried for a while. Fusion is another one that's common. Cherokee is a nice dark red that's really nice. These are all varieties that kind of have that like romaine crisp sweetness, just maybe won't form that like nice tight head that that you would characterize with a romaine. There's also a new one this year called Gordini that I think is going to fit the bill really nicely from what I've seen in trials in Ohio in this region in the summer. It's a little bit more upright, and so it doesn't get quite that bottom rot in the summer months. And then in the radish category, salad radishes are of course a pretty big crop if you're a market gardener and are looking to kind of have quick turnover of your beds. But a challenge in the heat, of course, is that radishes can get pithy, can get really spicy, and can also kind of turn lumpy and a little bit more oblong in the heat. So we have a new variety this year called Pepito that is really kind of rated as being a great variety for heat tolerance. It's a really fast variety, and it also tends to like hold that nice round shape really nicely. And then just as a category of radishes that might be nice to think about when you're thinking about what to grow in the heat, a lot of the mini daikon types tend not to get quite as spicy or as pithy in the warmer conditions as a salad radish would. So if your market seems like they might be interested in a mini daikon, then as a substitute for a traditional salad radish, then that's another option too. Chinese or Napa cabbage are a great option in that cabbage class. There's a picture up there of one of our varieties that kind of fits the bill for like a nice crunchy salad component in the summer, but it holds up a lot better in the heat compared to cabbage and lettuce varieties. So that's a nice option too. In the fennel category, if anyone are fennel growers here, there's a big swing in difference in terms of bolt tolerance for different varieties of fennel. So one that is in particular like really a standout in terms of its bolt tolerance is Dragon. So if you're looking to grow fennel kind of not just into that fall slot, but into the summer heat and harvest it for markets, then I'd look into that variety. And then a few other kind of crops that I know are always challenging to grow in the heat. Cilantro is one. There's two varieties I would recommend there that are really fast and that are slow to bolt. So that's Calypso and Cruiser. And then in the heading broccoli category, there's a few here that have been selected through this like Northeast Broccoli project that came about, probably like 10 years ago or so, that was really kind of set on trying to breed broccoli for the eastern conditions of the United States, not just what works in California. And out of that program came a handful of ones that have really nice kind of bead formation and heat tolerance for those hot summers. So Imperial is one that came out of that program. Green Magic is a really nice one for the southern conditions. It produces a nice head and then nice side shoot production. And Monty's a new one that's kind of also in that class. Yeah.
Trials south. that how you're getting it?
Yeah.
The heat tolerance?
Yeah, so these varieties have all been trialed in southern conditions. They're not necessarily bred
Okay.
in southern conditions. I mean, that's kind of the challenge, honestly, for like that a lot of folks in the southeast or more southern areas are going to deal with, is that like the ideal probably would be that like from the beginning of the breeding cycle, it's developed in the region, and then you have a variety that's really like best suited for that region. In the absence of that, what we like try to do is trial them extensively, these varieties in these different regions, to kind of figure out what works best. Yeah, good question.
The heat tolerance on broccoli, is that like as it's maturing late, like early summer? But is that also for like starting them for the fall in the heat of the summer?
Yeah. So in terms of broccoli heat tolerance, these in particular, Monty and Green Magic in particular, are ones that work well maturing into the hottest part of the summer. So the heat tolerance in broccoli, what often happens is that you'll get little like pockets of heat in the head that cause different rates of growth of the bead formation. And so then you'll see like just this kind of really ugly head of like pockets where the beads have grown at a faster rate than others. And the result is that it'll be pretty lumpy and ununiform. So oftentimes that like heat tolerance is most important at the time when the head is forming. So all three of these varieties in particular are, have that heat tolerance during the time when the head is forming. Imperial, I would say, is one that I've also seen grown quite a bit into the fall, but I actually don't have information on Green Magic and Monty, or even of other varieties, and how they would compare or contrast kind of for that early growth stage compared to like when they're forming that head in the heat. Does that make sense? Yeah, because I would think like alternaria would probably be your bigger concern, honestly, for a lot of those like fall production broccoli crops. And so you would want to be looking at varieties that have more of that alternaria resistance going into the fall. Because I think you could manage the heat in the summer during that early stage of production just by like some agronomic practices of like increasing water and like water frequency, versus like needing to select a variety that's going to do best in the heat at that time, if that makes sense. Yeah. Any other questions? I had a few notes on some tomatoes as well that we've seen perform well in the southeast and in really hot, humid summer conditions. So there's a whole list of varieties. In our catalog, we have a little like heat set label that you can filter on the website, or that you can see in the catalog, that indicates like varieties that in particular would do well in warmer conditions, like this region. Firebird is a new determinate slicer that's a newer release that's really bred for the southeast. So it's a nice option as a field tomato, especially for that like early tomato planting, and then subsequent later plantings where they're maturing, in the hottest part of the summer where you're most likely to get some blossom drop. Verona is a red cocktail variety that also does well in the tunnel. That's kind of got these like nice 2-ounce fruit. That's like comparable to like a Juliet type of tomato, if you're familiar with that. And then this is kind of my personal hill that I'm going to die on, because I love this variety so much. It's called TY Yellow Mimi. It's a yellow cherry specifically it's bred for the tunnel, but it also does well in the field in the south. It just has these like tremendous trusses of cherries. So even if you do get a little bit of blossom drop, the yield is still really nice on them. And it's just it's a pretty delicious plant to grow. It's hard to beat a sun gold in this class of tomato, I'd say, but my toddler really likes this variety. So if that's any any win. Yeah, question. So the Firebird is not, the Firebird and the TY Yellow Mimi are not, and Verona is. All of them are untreated seed, are available as untreated seed, so you could use them for organic production, but not all of them are organic seed. I'm going to talk a little bit about days to maturity, unless anyone had any other questions kind of on heat set or on slotting. Okay. Okay, so days to maturity for a crop, generally in a seed catalog, this is listed right under the crop or, on the side of the page or right underneath it in the catalog. For different, I'll just say read the fine print in your catalog, because sometimes that days to maturity is from transplant versus sometimes it's from seed. So, just be aware of that might vary depending on the source for where you're getting your seed. What I've seen for organic growers in particular is that, shorter day to maturity varieties can really be a nice first line of defense against a lot of disease pressure. And that's because you're getting something that's pretty quick to mature, you're getting it out of the field before some of those diseases can come in. Where I think I've seen organic growers struggle the most is in trying to maintain something over a really long period during the season. So, have as a tool in your toolbox this idea that, growing some of these quick to mature varieties can be a way to kind of outrun the disease almost by getting the plant out before it really sets in. This can also be helpful in the heat for kind of the same idea. You're getting it to mature quickly, you're able to get it out of the field before you really start to see a lot of those detrimental effects from the heat. And then just know, as we talked about with the yield, there's always kind of some trade-offs in the faster varieties. So what you might see in terms of a really quick variety might not quite have the sugar development that a variety that's been able to grow and mature kind of over a longer period will. So that might influence the flavor. It might influence, especially we see this in red onions. Often the fast red onions aren't quite as nice dark red as a longer day onion, longer day to maturity onion, I should say. And then this is true with a lot of the squashes. So oftentimes the really fast winter squashes often have the lower storage potential going into the winter. So the ones that are faster, so think your acorns and your delicata, are often the ones that don't have the same storage potential as your butternuts and other varieties that have more time to kind of really develop that thick skin. So with that, I wanted to talk about kind of a few categories of fast to mature crops that can be nice, kind of nice things to think about in terms of developing your crop plan and selecting varieties. So mini broccoli is one. I know we just talked about broccoli and some examples of broccoli that does well in the heat. A kind of way to beat that in general is to not grow head broccoli in the summer, and instead to grow this kind of increasingly popular category of broccoli where you're really almost just pretty much harvesting it for side shoot production. So there's a couple of varieties that are really bred for this. BC 1611 is one that's been around for a while and is probably top of the class in terms of broccoli production in the summer. You're able to get 6 weeks worth of harvest off of a single planting. So it's not one where you're just kind of harvesting side shoots for a second and then it's done. It's one that can stick around for a while. You can also kind of play a lot with the spacing of broccoli in order to quicken maturity. So, if you're planting it a little bit tighter, it's going, the broccoli part of the plant is the flower. So that plant is going to be faster to flower. So you can pack it in a little bit in terms of spacing to get a faster flower or a faster harvest out of it. What you're going to lose there, though, is you're not going to have as long of a harvest window because that plant isn't going to be able to get as big in order to produce flowers or broccoli for as long of a period of time. A new variety that's a different type of broccoli, still in that mini broccoli category, is called Sidekick. This is a strain of broccoli that's really been developed in Brazil and kind of bred for those hot summers and staying nice and sweet and tender in those conditions. So that's one that we're offering this year that we've been kind of working on breeding for a number of years and selecting kind of strains that work well for East Coast summers. Another category to think about are this class of cauliflowers called green stem cauliflowers. They're popular in Asia. And there's, hold on, I'm gonna go back a few because there's a picture of it. So this is the variety that's listed. It's called Song TJ65. Basically, like, this operates kind of like a one-cut lettuce. So you can harvest it, it forms what looks like kind of a traditional head of cauliflower, and you can cut it off at the bottom, and that head is still intact. It looks like a nice cauliflower. But then as a consumer, when I take that cauliflower head home and I turn it on its side to cut it into a bunch of florets, I only have to make one cut, and then it all falls apart. A very nice thing as a consumer, I will say, who enjoys eating cauliflower but hates cutting traditional cauliflower. So anyways, there's kind of this whole class of green stem cauliflowers. There's even purple varieties now, and a Romanesco type one as well. But that class generally tends to be a lot more heat tolerant and tends to be really fast to mature. So it's a nice cauliflower if you have not had success growing cauliflower before, I would say. And then there's a couple other examples here in the pumpkin and cabbage class for pretty fast varieties that are kind of well suited for growing quickly and getting out of the field. Tiaras, like cabbage, similar to broccoli, is a crop that you can pack in really tight and influence the head size. So for tiara, you can put it at 6-inch spacing in bed, so you're really packing in the number of cabbages in a bed, and then you're cutting it 63 days is from seed. So if you're transplanting, you'd be cutting it about a month and a half later. Any questions on days to maturity? Yeah.
So I always struggle on days maturity in the fall. The days are getting shorter.
Yeah.
They're slowing down. They're not speeding up.
Yeah.
And also, I don't see much information on how long typical harvest is. So like you said, for broccoli, it's, is it 3 weeks? Is it 2 weeks? So any suggestions there? Start earlier?
Great questions. Okay. So yeah, for a lot of the fall plantings, because even if temperatures are still staying pretty warm, those decreasing day lengths are going to decrease your rate of growth. I can tell you what I did as a grower frequently. So if I, for example, was doing lettuce or any crop that I was seeding weekly throughout the spring and going into the summer, by August 1st, any planting that I would do after August 1st, I would double up the amount of plants and then move to an every 10-day cycle. So I would just space out the successions, assuming that I can get a longer harvest window in the field out of anything grown in the fall. Because even if the temperatures are still pretty warm, those shortened day length hours mean that that time where the temperature is hot is going to be shorter than it is in the summer, where you're looking at 14 hours of heat. So you're going to have a longer nighttime period to cool off your crop more in the fall. So it tends to be a bit more, even if it's really hot, you tend to have a little bit more resilience to the heat going into the fall because the days are shorter. So I would always space out my successions a little bit more and just kind of plant double, assuming that I could hold it in the field longer going into the fall months. Yeah. Wait, you had another part to your question. What else are you asking?
Well, just really how many days
Yeah. So the other thought is, like, I mean, this is a failing of like how a lot of the information is presented in seed catalogs, probably because it's like hard to present all of this information. But generally, like the rule of thumb is that you're going to have a longer harvest window in the fall and in the early spring than you are going to in the summer for pretty much all crops, right? Like things are going to mature faster in a way that's going to make them less marketable in the summer months. So you have to like pick them pretty quick. In the fall, I'll say like you generally have better what's called field holding. So you would want to look for that like field holding label on a crop in a seed catalog in order to like understand that it generally like would hold better in the field during those different times of year. But I'll say also like even if it's not listed in the catalog, I think there's a page on here somewhere of like when in doubt, talk to your seed rep. Like a lot of times, like if you call in and ask us these kinds of questions, this is the kind of information we have like in back of house that I can like look up and tell you like, okay, here are the differences that we've seen in terms of field holding for these different varieties. Because at some point it's just like too much to put in the seed catalog. But a lot of that information does exist and we're happy to help. So that would be my other kind of comment is, yeah, feel free to reach out if you have specific questions. Yeah.
So you were talking about spacing with the mini broccoli. Do you think there's any way if I space them close enough, I could make up for the volume that it would have with a larger broccoli? Because if I'm going to invest all the money to have people manually harvest, I want to make sure I can get the same amount of volume that I could with a larger broccoli.
Yeah, good question. Well, okay. The other advantage is that like in the time that you're planting that larger broccoli, you could almost do like 2 successions of this mini broccoli. So in that bed space for like 2 months or, for 3 months or something, you could like plant the equivalent of like twice the number of plantings for the mini broccoli of the head or the bigger broccoli. All that aside, I don't think I would go tighter than 6-inch spacing on the broccoli, in row and between row. So you could do 4 rows per bed, 6-inch spacing in row, and I think that's the tightest. That's the tightest I've seen. I think that's the tightest I'd recommend. You'd probably get 2 pickings off of it. So it would make picking easier because you wouldn't be digging down as much into the side shoots. Most of it would be like kind of up top where the broccoli would be or like at the top side shoots. So it probably would make picking easier. It does make picking easier to, think about it that way. You're not going to be holding on to it for that long. So if you're only doing 2 pickings, you're probably just getting like a 2-week harvest window off of each succession. And so from what I've seen for like growers who are really like space limited, the mini broccoli kind of fits into that rotation with other crops that they're looking to cycle through on that like, kind of like 6 weeks or 5 to 6 week cycle in a bed, and are like pretty reasonably profitable in that model. But I don't have enough information to know if you could do it tighter and then get the same kind of like bulk weight. I think like if you're comparing weight to weight, the heading broccoli is always going to win. But the mini broccoli, you can kind of get a premium for a smaller weight. So I think value-wise, revenue-wise, you're probably looking at something that would ultimately be more profitable if you have the labor to pick it. Yeah. Did that answer your question? Okay, great. Okay. Yeah.
Which of those varieties do you have in organic seed?
Good questions. Okay, Racer, we have an organic seed. Sidekick, we have an organic seed. BC 1611, we do not have an organic seed, but it is, again, not treated, so suitable for organic production. And I don't know on the song TJS offhand whether that's organic or not. Yeah. What's that? Yeah, oh yeah, and I think tiara is as well. You're right, yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go on to talk a little bit about disease resistance. Okay, so disease resistance and whether or not you need it in varieties. This is a picture of a variety that does not have black rot resistance, that has black rot. But disease resistance is kind of a tricky thing. You know, like you don't always necessarily need disease resistance. So, you know, why get a variety that maybe has it if you don't need it? I think probably the most important step, this is maybe a little obvious, is to really ID what diseases you likely have in the field or what you're seeing over the course of your season before you start kind of, you know, running to look at the disease codes in the catalog. This can also come in like, you know, in either like UK or Oak maybe has some information as well to support you in that effort and kind of understanding what regionally is really important disease-wise. I know in Michigan, like Michigan State produces like a field report every week that like talks about the disease conditions in the state weekly. So that's kind of a really nice thing to read to get an understanding of like what I might be seeing in my fields. And then another thing kind of to note about disease resistance is that even if something isn't identified in a catalog as having a disease resistance, it can still have certain characteristics that can make it less susceptible to disease. So like I talked about that Gordini lettuce seed earlier, you know, that doesn't necessarily, there's no like disease resistance to bottom rot, which is often kind of like a cocktail of diseases that causes lettuce, lower leaves of lettuce to be brown. But it has this more kind of upright shape that keeps it off the ground. And as a result, you have less soil to leaf contact. And so there's less disease kind of getting into the plant from the soil. So, you know, there are some kind of like things like that to be thinking about with plants, with the different crop varieties, even if they don't have a listed disease resistance. I just want to talk a little bit about the disease codes you might see on there. So in seed catalogs, you can either see something that's has a high resistance to a certain disease or an intermediate resistance. So this kind of sillily like cut off picture here. Oh, you can't see it. Okay, so it says powdery mildew, and then in parentheses it says intermediate. So it has intermediate resistance to powdery mildew. So just to kind of understand what exactly those high versus intermediate mean, I think I switched these slides later, so sorry, I don't think this definition is as helpful, but I'll explain. So high resistance in the face of like a really intense disease pressure, so what you would classify as like high disease pressure or heavy disease pressure, that variety should still show minimal marketable defects from that disease. So a high resistance variety is really going to be like if you're looking for a genetic solution to your disease problem, an intermediate resistance variety is probably not totally going to cut it for you in general. It might help, but it's not going to be the only solution that you're going to need for that disease. Intermediate resistance means that there's that plant in the face of heavy disease pressure. You're going to see kind of more variable results, but better than if it didn't have any disease resistance. So that's a pretty vague understanding of what intermediate or like definition for resistance, right? And what makes it even more fuzzy is that like different breeders, ultimately, you know, it's the breeder of the seed that's characterizing whether or not a seed has resistance to a disease. They have an incentive, you know, like we all have an incentive to not overhype our disease because, you know, if it comes back and it doesn't have that, then it's not going to sell. It's going to look bad on that company. But still, there's still a lot of variation in what people will claim in terms of resistance. I'll say it, Johnny's, we don't list something as having that disease resistance unless we observe that resistance in our trials. So there's a little bit of like an extra check there. But just know that like when you see that something is listed as having a resistance, especially an intermediate resistance, That provides some level of protection, but is not, kind of the only thing that you might need in that circumstance. And then I'll just say, because this is probably a big one, in particular, powdery mildew resistance for all the cucurbits. What you're going to be looking for there is like sometimes that resistance is listed in the name in particular. So in seed catalogs, you see it as like a PM or a PMR code. For sunflowers, say for downy mildew, you see it as a DM or a DMR code. And sometimes that's listed in the variety name. So it would be like Racer, PMR. But then also sometimes it's just listed on that like info page or in the catalog. So this is an example of a winter squash comparison chart. You'll see on the right side, we have a column for disease resistance, and then it just lists IR and then the disease. So IR is intermediate resistance, and then the disease that that it has resistance to. And you'll see like in this is a great example. As of right now in the market, we haven't seen anything that has high resistance to powdery mildew. So that like doesn't exist currently in the squash world, really. Okay. How much time do I have? A little bit of time? Good. Okay, great. Any questions on disease resistances? Yeah.
If you could go back to the previous slide, and you kind of touched on this, so I just want to make sure I'm reading the chart correctly. Like if I'm looking at acorn squash for days to maturity, that really seems to have a correlation to the storage potential for months because of how thick the skin can get, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay. Now for vine length, does that have correlation to the weight range, or is it just the case with the three types we're looking at right now?
Good question. So the vine length can vary quite a bit in terms of, so a bush variety is generally going to produce smaller fruit as a general rule than a vining.
Right.
But the length of the vine versus the fruit size can still, I think it's not exactly an exact correlation.
Okay.
So, yeah, I would think, like as a general rule, like a long vine variety would probably be higher yielding because it's like producing more leaves, more photosynthesis, but that's not necessarily true. That you can kind of pack more fruit into a more compact plant sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
For me personally, on disease resistance, I find that spacing plays such a big part in that. So typically, I space further apart if I'm unsure of something until I have enough experience with that, and then tighten it up as I become better with that variety.
That is a great point. So yeah, non-variety selection related tool to disease management is to really manage your spacing. Tighter spacing crops are, creating a more humid environment around the base of your plants and are going to be more likely to really foster the environments for that disease to spread. So that's a really good, important point. Okay. Talk a little bit about some of the, kind of specific traits for these, for tunnel environments in particular. So in, a seed catalog, you might see that something's listed as like a greenhouse performer or a tunnel performer. You might want to know, okay, like what does that mean? Could I just grow something that's not listed as that in that environment and it would do fine? The answer is sometimes, but here are some of the, just so you kind of are aware, here are some of the specific traits that we're talking about when we're talking about these different varieties that are really have that like special class of greenhouse performers. So within cucumbers, there's three things I want to talk about there. Cucumbers that are bred or that are noted as being selected for the tunnel environment are parthenocarpic, which means that they do not require a pollinator in order to set fruit. So that's a big benefit for cucumbers in particular in a tunnel because it means that you can enclose the tunnel and exclude probably the biggest pest for cucumbers, which is cucumber beetle. I will say a kind of a flip side of parthenocarpy is that if pollinators do get into the space, the result is that you can get some misshapen fruit. So if you're growing a variety that's parthenocarpic out in the field and you see some examples of pretty misshapen fruit, that could be an example of a pollinator getting in there and ultimately creating some of these not ideal fruit shapes. Gynoecious versus monoecious. Okay, so gynoecious is a classification that describes the flowers on the plant. So a gynoecious variety is going to have primarily female flowers. What that means in practice is that those are often higher yielding and they often have a more concentrated fruit set. So you're going to be getting fruit over a shortened window of time, but more of it. Versus monoecious varieties, those have both male and female flowers. They tend to have a more indeterminate harvest window, so you're harvesting them over a longer period of time, and it's not quite as much of a spike in harvest and then a reduction. And then the other kind of component of cucumbers in particular, this picture demonstrates an example of a cucumber that aborted because of high temperatures. And so that's a real distinguisher between different varieties. Some of them will not be as tolerant of those high temperature conditions in a tunnel, and so will abort fruit. So we are looking for varieties that fruit set at high temperatures, something that's sometimes called heat set. Gynoecious varieties are most of the tunnel varieties, but there are a few examples of ones that are more monoecious, so not necessarily all of them have that trait, but most of them do. For tomatoes, the kind of characteristics that we're looking for there are mostly around what we would call plant architecture or plant shape. So we're looking for plants that have shorter internodes, that's the space between leaves and hence fruit clusters on the plant. We want that to be more compact. So you're not having to trellis quite as high to get the same number of fruit clusters. We want it to be a more shorter statured plant in order to kind of produce more fruit without having to trellis as much. Consistent sustained fruit set, so we're looking for something that's going to produce over a longer period of time like you can in a tunnel. Fruit, again, that can set temperature, or a plant that can set fruit at higher temperatures. Ideally one that's less prone to some of the morphological disease or issues that you see with high tunnel tomatoes, resulting because of nutrient issues. So that's YSD here, which is yellow shoulder disease, and white wall. Those are two conditions you'll see in tunnel tomatoes often that are really a symptom of poor potassium flow in the plant. And so we're kind of looking and selecting varieties that are less prone to showing those symptoms if they're having potassium issues. It's not as simple often as pumping more potassium into your system in those cases, because a lot of times that potassium flow issue is because of the warm and humid environment in the tunnel. So it's often more about tunnel management than it is about just increasing the amount of potassium. But there is variety difference in terms of which ones will be a lot more susceptible to those yellow shouldering and white wall. And then for peppers, pretty much any pepper that you have is going to benefit from a tunnel environment. Peppers love the heat. So just know that kind of as a standard. But in particular, we're looking for ones that have good fruit set at both high and low temperatures. If you're growing an early crop of peppers, this can be a particular pain point because the fruiting for peppers in low temperature conditions it can be tricky. And then we're looking for ones that are early maturing, have that sustained harvest, and then just are a really vigorous plant that are going to keep producing over a longer period of time. Any questions on some of those tunnel crops? How many people are growing in high tunnels right now? Cool. Growing these crops in high tunnels? Yeah, okay. Cool. Oh, yeah. Oh, the zucchini? Yeah. Oh, that's true. So that's the only one in that class currently that we have. We have a zucchini variety, yes, thank you, called Maverick. That is, so this first trait about cucumber is about it being parthenocarpic. It's actually kind of like a spectrum. There's not like, either it's parthenocarpic or it's not. There's like some that can be like semi-parthenocarpic. And in the zucchini world in particular, we tend to see more plants kind of in the middle of that spectrum. Maverick is one that sets fruit really well without a pollinator. So you can grow it early in a high tunnel and get that early zucchini crop before everyone else has it coming out of their field. It tends to have a really concentrated fruit set though, so it's really kind of meant for that like early crop and then probably get it out of the tunnel in favor of something else because it's not going to produce as long as well. And then I just had some comments on kind of the flip side of this. I think my slide pasted some of my lettuce pictures. So that's not Blue Rock Salvia, Sunland, and Monte Carlo. That's a spinach variety. But just kind of some notes about growing greens in the winter tunnel, some things to think about, especially for spinach. Downy mildew is probably one of the bigger disease pressure issues in the winter tunnel in this region. There's a ton of different races of downy mildew. So often if you're thinking about kind of what varieties to grow in the winter tunnel, it's a good idea to grow a few varieties that have different coverage of those downy mildew races. So some might be resistant to, let's say, like 1 through 10, and others are 11 through 20, just for simplicity's sake. So you'd maybe want to grow both of those varieties because it's hard often to know exactly what race of downy mildew you have in a region, and oftentimes you can have more than one. So that's a good idea, kind of a good vote for growing a couple varieties in that kind of condition. Also, there's a difference between a variety having cold vigor and tolerance to cold damage. So we see this a lot in lettuces. Lettuces, like some are really vigorous in the cold, so they're going to grow still even in colder conditions. Others, and sometimes it's the same variety, but others maybe are just more tolerant of it being cold without showing damage. So a lot of times, like, we'll see like the romaines tend to be less tolerant to cold damage because like the leaf is, you're gonna see the imperfections more than you would with like a sweet crisp or some other kind of lettuce that has more texture that's gonna hide some of those, maybe some of those cold damage imperfections a little bit better. So that's just an important thing to note. Sometimes that's noted in the seed catalog, or you can always ask your rep kind of about those characteristics. And then also just generally with growing romaine lettuce going into the winter, not sure if this is as popular of a thing, but if you are trying to do that, just be aware that there's a lot of variety difference in terms of how romaines respond to low light conditions. Oftentimes they can knot head and kind of do this thing where they like twist around themselves in those low light conditions. So there's some options there for what works best in those conditions. And then finally, got through almost this whole talk without mentioning Salanova, but I just wanted to say one thing about it here as an example. I think like these high value spaces are probably the times where once you kind of get comfortable with the growing environment, it probably is worth it to spend a little bit more on varieties that have the disease resistance or the vigor or the kind of cut quality to be able to like give you the most bang for your buck in that environment. So that's why, especially going into the winter, I think you see a lot of growers who, if they're not growing Salanova year round, they might grow one of those nicer one-cut lettuces at that time of year because it has those qualities that, make it worthwhile if you can only plant one crop for those 3 or 4 months that you're growing in the winter. And then finally, just to say, like, for the sake of, talking about that redundancy point I made early on, don't get too attached to a lot of varieties. They change. This is an example of like a few that are going away this year or that have already gone away, and then replacement varieties that we have. So, you know, just know, like, as a part of our system, and probably for most seed catalogs, you know, they're looking at like, oh, this variety is being dropped, we need to find something that's similar in that class. So they likely have a little bit of information about like what is a good replacement if you have fallen in love with one variety and it's going away. This QR catalog takes you to the full list of everything that's been dropped or that's in low supply this year, and kind of the recommended replacements so that you can see that too. But that's just kind of an important thing to know. Always be trialing a little bit because it's helpful in case you're in a pinch in terms of seed availability one year. When in doubt, call your seed rep. We can help. We have more information usually that we can access, or you know, for us at Johnny's, like the whole research farm usually is available to answer questions if you have something that I can't answer. So I'm happy to be the person who directs you to that kind of information. I have a little slide on this we can talk about, or if anyone has any other questions or things they'd like to bring up. But I'd love to hear any comments kind of on thinking about like what varieties you love, what, you know, and how you're thinking about variety selection, and then like what you need that you can't find. So if anyone has any kind of thoughts on those, or has any comments or questions they want to ask, that's pretty much the end of my presentation at this point. So. I'll say also, I just want to like, again, put in that plug about regional variety trialing. I am always looking for people to do that with. So if you're interested, please approach me, even if it's not a formal trial, but you're struggling with some variety and you want to talk about, you know, what the other options are. We can like talk about other samples and then like give them a try. I'm here for it. So yeah. Sorry, I wasn't, yeah.
Is there like an amount of space that you would need if you were thinking about doing a trial like that? Is there like a minimum amount of space?
I mean, it's pretty small for the formal trials. I'll give you like an example for tomato, like tunnel tomatoes. It's like you need to have 6 plants of the trial variety. For other ones, it can be like, you know, ideally we'd like to see a whole bed of this, you know, so it might be like a bed of arugula or something like that in the field. But some of those, especially those like formal trials, they can go down to be pretty small amounts of space. Yeah. Again, so that you're not dedicating all of your space to like something that may or may not work, which we would not want. Yeah.
Are there plans to have Salanova organic ever?
I think the short answer is no. There are alternatives that are organic seed, but in that class of crops, but I don't think they're quite all the same kind of caliber as the Salanova line. The breeder does not have an organic lettuce program at all. So as far as I know, no. But if they do, I will be the first person to shout it out to the world. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? I'll also just say, this is my contact information here. Please reach out to me. Yeah. And this is my dog. Okay.
Thank you, Dana.
Thank you.
Please don't forget to fill out the feedback. Thank you.